For the third reading today, I've chosen a passage from Genesis chapter 1. I've shortened it a little bit, but it'll be the theme actually for this month. I'm going to talk about creation stories. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. God saw that the light was good. And he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And God said, "Let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water." So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. And it was so. God called the vault sky. And there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. And God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered into one place, and let dry ground appear." And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and the gathered waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it according to their various kinds." And it was so. And there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years, and let them be lights in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth." And it was so. And there was evening, and there was morning, the fourth day. And God said, "Let the water teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the vault of the sky." So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living thing with which water teems, and that moves about in it according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and increase in number, and fill the water in the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth." And there was evening, and there was morning, the fifth day. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea, and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. These are words inspired by God. So for September, I've chosen as my theme the question, how did creation happen? So today I want to look at the biblical theory of creation. And then next Sunday, God willing, I'll talk about the scientific theory of creation and also my own personal theory of creation. So today I'm going to focus completely on the biblical theory of creation, particularly from Genesis chapter 1, which I just read for you. So I'm going to go through this piece again, pretty much line by line, and I'm going to comment on it. I'm going to exegete it or kind of unpack it according to my own insights of what it's really saying. So I'm going to start obviously with verse 1. It says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Now the problem is we're reading this in English, and the original obviously was written in Hebrew. And the word that's used in Hebrew is Bereshit. And Bereshit does not mean in the beginning, it means in a beginning. If the word had been Bereshit, it would have meant in the beginning. But that's not the first word. The first word is Bereshit. And Bereshit means in a beginning. So when I unpack this and research I've done over the years is that it's not actually an account of the creation of the world, but rather an account of the restoration of the world after some kind of a global disaster. And when you understand that piece, it totally reframes many of the statements that you're going to find in this account. And particularly where it seems to clash violently with the science. When we understand that this is a beginning, in a beginning. In other words, it is not, I believe, a story of the creation from the world at the start, in some kind of a big bang, but rather it's about the restoration of the world after some kind of a global disaster. And we know when we study the kind of the geology, the geological record of the world, that there have been many kinds of disasters, global disasters in the history of planet Earth over 4.6 billion of years. So a typical one, for instance, is a comet strike, a huge comet striking planet Earth. And what happens is you get literally global fires and you get dirt kicked up into the atmosphere and the atmosphere completely covered in smoke. And sometimes this condition can last thousands of years. During this period of time then, there is no sun. And the Earth begins to freeze over. You go into an ice age because the sun isn't getting through. And then when the ice begins to melt, you get a flood and you get extinction events. So it seems to me that, this story in Genesis is not an account of the creation of the world at the beginning. It's an account of the restoration of the world in a beginning, or a rebooting of the system. So when you understand the difference then in the Hebrew between Bereshit and Bereshit, between in a beginning and in the beginning, it clears up a lot of the misunderstandings. So when next Sunday I talk about the scientific notion of Genesis, you'll see that there's quite a bit of dovetailing rather than contradictions. Now, if you take it then, Bereshit, in a beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the reason was because the skies and the heavens only became visible again to whatever survivors there were after hundreds of years, maybe even thousands of years of utter darkness on the planet because of some kind of a global disaster, a cometary strike or whatever. So this is a new beginning. And at this stage, God is recreating the heavens and the earth because for the first time in perhaps thousands of years, the heavens are becoming visible again. And even the earth is becoming visible again to the survivors. And you get this in legends, versions of this throughout human history. The notion of Lemuria, which allegedly was a lost continent of the present continent of India, which, flourished and then got destroyed. And then the legend of Atlantis, somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, where, an extraordinary civilization that also got destroyed. And we know from the geological evidence that there was a period called the Younger Dryas that happened about 12,500 years ago, in which fragments of a huge comet bombarded North America and instantaneously dissolved the great ice sheet on North America, literally 2 miles thick of ice, and it dissolved almost immediately, and flowed into the east and west. And so you get a global flood. And so the sea levels rise and there's flooding all over. So we know, for instance, that in this Younger Dryas period, which is just 12,500 years ago, and it lasted for 1,300 years. So whatever civilizations survived in that, this text from Genesis is going to make a lot of sense to them. In verse 2 it says, "Now the earth was formless and empty." And the reason I would believe is that it was formless and empty was that whatever survivors were left, whatever human survivors were left, they could not see any forms. They couldn't see mountains or trees because the atmosphere was thick with smoke and with dust for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so, to all intents and purposes, the earth was formless and it was empty because there was nothing to kind of rest the eyes upon. We are told as well in verse 2 that darkness was over the surface of the deep. And the reason for that, I believe, was that the formerly blue sky and the blue ocean were indistinguishable from each other for many, many, many years. So there was darkness over the surface of the deep because you could not see the blue ocean anymore. And then we are told that the Spirit of God, Ruach Yahweh, was hovering over the waters. Now, it seems to me, I think there's a lot of evidence to support that the Spirit of God is not just kind of the divine breathing kind of a new life into the planet, but that it involves Ruach Yahweh in the original Hebrew actually means some kind of a technology, a technological system, or even an aircraft of some kind. And so whether you're talking about God or extraterrestrials or sky beings, it's the beginning of the cleanup preparation. So the Spirit of God hovering over the waters is the beginning of the cleanup after this global catastrophe. And then we learn in verse 3, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. So what's happening here? What's happening here is that for the first time in perhaps thousands of years, light is coming through, that the darkness is dissipating because of this technology of Ruach Yahweh. And so for the first time ever, there's a breakthrough of light onto the planet. And now the sun is visible for the first time. And now photosynthesis can begin. And now plants can begin to grow. And now herbivores can live from the plants and carnivores can live from the herbivores. And now life is starting again. So light was the breakthrough that reignited the system of life on planet Earth. In verse 4 we read, and God saw that the light was good. Now one of the things, if you were paying attention to the reading, there are these mantras that appear right throughout this short reading, again and again and again, as if this is an extraordinary poem. It's almost Hindu in its repetition of these beautiful mantras. And the mantras again and again are, God saw that it was good, God names the stages, God blesses the stages, and God even counts the stages. This was day 1, or this was day 2, or whatever. And so it's like it's a prayer, a repetition of prayer in service of light. In verse 5 we then read, and there was evening and there was morning the first day, or the second day, or whatever. And it's interesting, it doesn't say there was morning and evening, it says there was evening and morning. And my hit in this is that when the sun first broke through, it was it was actually evening time as far as the planet was rotating. So the first glimpse that the human being saw of the sun was as it was going down in the evening tide. And thereafter, the Hebrews would always measure the day. The day began with sunset, not with sunrise. As the sun was going down, that's the beginning of the day. And we have the very same thing in Celtic mythology. In the Celtic mythology, the day begins at sunset. And so I believe that the reason was that when they finally got to see clearer heavens, that the earth had spun in such a place that the sun was actually descending for the first few ahead of it. And we go to verses 6 and 7. And God said, let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water. So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the waters above the vault. And my hit in this is that now, as the smog is dissolving, there's enough gap, you can see clearly a gap between the earth, and the sea and the sky. For the first time ever, you can see differentiation between them. And so it would appear that God is creating a vault separating, the waters below from the waters above. What's happening is now for the first time ever, rain is possible again. So there's water coming down from above. And now for the first time, they can actually see the oceans and perhaps even the streams. So this is a beautiful kind of a rendition of separation, meaning the separation is in the human perspective, not in the physicality of itself. In verse 9 we read, and God said, let the water under the sky be gathered into one place and let dry ground appear. And so my take on this is that now the drying process can really begin. Now because there's regular sunshine, now the earth can begin to dry out. And now you're getting an apparent separation between the seas and the land. And this happens throughout the geological history again and again and again. When you look at the geological record, this happens often. You get ice ages, for instance, and then you get desertification, where land dries out completely. Now, we know actually fact from the geological record that less than 5,000 years ago, the Sahara Desert was a huge freshwater lake. So that is how frequently you get this expansion and this contraction of the waters. And the beings who are still alive, and recovering from this devastation are beginning to realize, like the cessation, that the sea is withdrawing a little bit, that dry land is appearing. And certainly less than 5,000 years ago, there's evidence of that, as I say, in the Sahara Desert itself. It was a freshwater lake less than 5,000 years ago. In verse 11, we hear God saying, let the land produce vegetation. And now flora can flourish. Now, because the sun is getting through, photosynthesis is happening, and now you get flora emerging. In verses 14 and 18, you get this apparent contradiction. It says, on day 4, God created the sun and the moon and the stars. So where did the light come from on day 1? Now, my own hit on that is that it is only at this stage that it becomes really clear, once the smog has dissolved sufficiently, it becomes really clear that they can actually now see the moon and see the stars, that in the haze that took time to dissolve, there was a period when there was light coming through, but they couldn't actually see the sun. And they certainly couldn't see the moon, and they very definitely could not see the stars. So as is clearing more and more and more on day 4, at some stage of the process, now they can actually see the sun, they can actually see the moon, and they can actually see the stars. So that we might kind of hit on that notion, that apparent contradiction between there being light on day 1, whereas the sun is only kind of created or seen on day 4. In verses 20 and 21 we read, and God said, let the waters teem with living creatures. So now marine life is flourishing again, because probably part of the problem is when sunlight is denied, even marine life suffers violently. So we know, for instance, that in a previous cometary strike, that over 80% of all marine life disappeared. 95% of life on the planet disappeared, on the dry land, and 80% of marine life disappeared. So now with the sunlight percolating deeper into the oceans again, now marine life is free to flourish again. And God says, let the birds fly above the earth across the vault of the sky. And now avian life is beginning to flourish again. Now it is safe to risk flight. Because if you're flying in a thick fog and breathing that kind of stuff in, you ain't going to last very long. So now, once again, the birds are flying above the earth because now avian life is capable of flourishing again. In verses 26 and 27, we read, and then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our own likeness. Now, it's interesting that this is a plural. Let us make mankind. So the word that's being used actually in the Hebrew version is Elohim, the word that we translate as God. There is no mention of a single divinity in the Hebrew scriptures. God is not mentioned in the Hebrew scriptures. There are 2 different words used. You have Elohim, which literally means the powerful ones, plural, or Yahweh, which is a word that they can't explain etymologically. There's no basis in any Semitic language for the word Yahweh. It's a made-up word. So there are titles given, to whatever being was responsible for this cleanup operation. So it may have been sky beings, extraterrestrials of various kind, and when God said, let us make mankind, it seems almost like a sky council is making a decision about what's going to happen to this little planet, which has suffered devastating consequences. And the decision was, let us make them in our image and likeness. Now, it's not like they were creating ex nihilo from scratch, but that they were working with whatever kind of hominids were still on the planet, and they were upgrading it. And so they're going to mix their own blood or their own DNA with the DNA of some earthlings, some hominids of various kinds. And you see this all over the Semitic languages, including Swahili. The word for a human in Swahili is binadamu. And in many of the Semitic languages, bin means son of or child of. And Adama in Hebrew means earth or soil. And damu means blood. And so you get the earthlings then are this kind of mixture of earth and the blood of the gods, or the kind of the DNA of the gods. And so it's almost like it's a triple pun, in the Semitic languages and in Swahili as well. So there's the mixture of the blood of the gods, the DNA of the gods, with the DNA of hominids, and also Adama, the earth, the soil itself, as part of it, as well as the blood of humans, the Damu. So we're told then that God created humankind in his own image, male and female, he created them. Now, when you think about this, they created them male and female in order that they would be able to breed. Because initially, when you read the Sumerian versions of the story, which are much, much, much older, God had to keep making new versions by mixing sky DNA with earth DNA. But these beings couldn't procreate. So they had to keep making more and more versions until finally they managed to create a version that was capable of breeding. And so this is the reason then for the creation in his own image. And it's also to represent the complementarity of the divine life force itself, the yin and the yang of the divine, the kind of the male and the female aspects of the divine. In verse 28, we read, so that human beings could rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and over all the wild animals and over all the creatures. Now, this is an unfortunately misinterpreted piece all the time. So the word that's used in Hebrew is the word radah. And radah has three different meanings in Hebrew. It means to dominate, it means to exploit, or it means to be responsible for, to be stewards of. So you can dominate nature, you can kind of use it as a resource, or you can be responsible and be stewards of it. So obviously, I would believe that this was the injunction, that it was, okay, you're the brightest kids on the block, you're responsible for and you're stewards of what we have just restored to you, rather than now you're free to dominate it and to use it as a resource. So let me give you the backstory then. The backstory is that these great stories that we find particularly in the book of Genesis, they're based on much, much earlier stories that come from Sumer. So in 1849, there was an extraordinary discovery in present-day what would have been known as Assyria. The library of a great king called Ashurbanipal. And Ashurbanipal had flourished around the year 660 before the Common Era. But he created what was then the greatest library the planet had ever seen. And he conquered the Levant, the entire Middle East. And he was raiding libraries of other places and gathering all these works together. So there's this extraordinary library of information, which was just discovered in 1849. And they discovered it wasn't written in parchment, it was written on clay tablets. So they discovered over 30,000 clay tablets, which are now in the British Museum, most of which have still not been even deciphered. And so the backstory then is these great stories that you're hearing about the creation and the flood, they're based on much, much earlier stories. So for instance, one of the stories is called the Enuma Elish. And this is 7 tablets that talk about the story of creation. And that's why you get the notion of the 7-day week within the Hebrew dispensation, that God created on day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6, and then rested on day 7. But it comes from the fact that this translation into the Hebrew was based on the 7 tablets of creation coming from Sumer. Now, the Enuma Elish then is the oldest recorded story in the world. It's over 5,000 years old. It goes way, way, way back beyond King Ashurbanipal himself. So it's the oldest recorded story the world has right now. And the book of Genesis, in our book of Genesis, it borrows hugely from this, and it gives it its own particular twist. The second great epic in the library was the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it is the oldest flood story ever recorded. Now, there are flood stories we find, in the oral traditions all over the world. But this is the oldest written version of a flood story, and again, it's going back nearly 5,000 years. And it tells the story of gods in the sense of sky beings of various kinds, that the chief of these sky beings was a god called Anu, and Anu had 2 sons, a guy called Enlil and a guy called Enki. And Enlil was given charge over Project Earth, to regulate planet Earth. But Enki was the great scientist, his son Enki. And at some stage, the gods decided that planet Earth wasn't working and they wanted to destroy it. And Enki tips off a guy called Ziusudra that there's going to be a global flood and go build an ark. Now Ziusudra, we'll find he'll be called Noah in the Hebrew version of it. But in the original version, he's called Ziusudra. Now, when the sky beings first, mixed their DNA with the DNA of human beings, there was a very different agenda. Initially, the function of these upgraded hominids was to work as gold miners in South Africa, because the sky beings were trying to mine gold in order to repair damage in the atmosphere of their own home planet called Nibiru. It's interesting, we use gold as well in the windscreen of our our space flights. So initially, they were created to be gold miners in South Africa. And then at some stage, some of them were brought to the Levant, to the Middle East, to work as gardeners. And then thirdly, they were called to be soldiers in the internecine warfares of the gods. And then finally, the gods found out that human beings were multiplying too much and they were far too noisy, and they decided to get rid of them. And that's what the story of Enki and Ziusudra is about. And finally, we see evidence of this again and again and again in the phenomenon of cargo cults, where technologically primitive peoples, when they encounter technologically advanced peoples, they regard them as gods. And this happened in the South Pacific during World War II, when airmen from the Japanese, airmen and American airmen were landing in islands in the South Pacific. The locals thought that they were gods, and they were bringing all kinds of goodies. They were bringing medicines and clothes and foods of various kinds. So when the war ended and these airmen disappeared, there was what were called cargo cults set up, religions set up in honor of the gods, hoping they'd come back and bring some more cargo with them. So I'm of the opinion that so many of our religious ideas on planet Earth are actually cargo cult ideas, rather than kind of worship of the true God. Very, very often they're mistaken. So what conclusion am I reaching, at the end of today's homily? Where does this leave the Bible, what I've just tried to unpack over the last 20 minutes? Where does this leave the Bible? Is the Bible the revealed word of God? Is it inerrant? Is it made up mishugas? Is it the fiction of primitive peoples? So how do you answer these kinds of questions? I've attempted to answer these questions in great detail in my book, which is called Setting God Free, Moving Beyond the Caricature We've Created in Our Own Image. I went to great pains to try to deal with these questions. But to give you today just a few simple one-liner answers, I believe the following. A, that mythology and stories are the archived wisdom of a culture. B, I believe that stories are the very best way to pass on wisdom to future generations, because they're entertaining, they're enduring, and they're dependent upon the state and the stage of spiritual enlightenment of the listeners. So every listener is going to unpack the same story in a very different fashion from his neighbor. Number C, I would say that Irish mythology, African folklore, the Pitakas of Buddhism, the Upanishads of Hinduism, etc., they all carry God's word, if you know how to listen with your heart and your soul, rather than merely with your intellect. And so, finally, I would say that the Genesis account is packed with precious gems if you know how to wrestle with God, which is the actual meaning of the name Israel, the man who wrestled with God. Are you ready to step into the ring? Namaste, my brothers and sisters.